My name is Rachel Ashford, and I was 24 years old when my mother told me I was dead to her. Not dead like a metaphor. She said the actual words. As far as this family is concerned, Rachel, you are dead to us. She said it standing in the doorway of the house I grew up in, outside Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing the same pearl earrings she wore to church every Sunday. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd yelled. My crime in their eyes was simple. I had fallen in love with a man named Marcus Bell. Marcus was kind, brilliant, hardworking, and black, and in my parents' world, a world built on old money and older prejudices that was unforgivable. This isn't just a story about hatred winning for a while. This is a story about what happened 9 years later, when the people who threw me away showed up needing something from me, and brought a lawyer to make sure they got it. But to understand why that day became the most satisfying moment of my life, you need to understand everything that came before it. Marcus and I met in graduate school at the University of Virginia. He studied structural engineering. I studied architecture. When we finally admitted we were in love, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I told my mother first. She stared at me for a long moment before asking, very calmly, "Is this a phase?" It wasn't. 8 months later, Marcus proposed in the botanical gardens where we'd had our first date, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. My family's reaction was swift. My mother refused to meet him. My father said I was throwing away everything he'd built for me. My older brother, Trevor, sent one text, "You're embarrassing us." Then silence. We married anyway. 40 guests, all from Marcus's side or our closest friends. Not one person from my family came. 3 weeks later, my mother called, and I foolishly thought she'd had a change of heart. Instead, she told me that if I went through with this, meaning my own marriage, I would no longer be welcome in the family. My trust fund, set aside by my grandfather for my education and future, would be redirected to Trevor. My name would be removed from the will. "You're dead to us," she said, and hung up. I sat on the floor of my apartment and cried for 3 hours. Marcus held me the whole time. He never told me it would be okay. He knew that would be a lie. Instead, he said, "We don't need people who only love you on their terms. We're going to build something they can't touch." That sentence became the blueprint for the next 9 years. Those first years were brutal. We were broke graduate students in a 600 square foot apartment in Richmond, Virginia. Marcus took a job at a mid-size engineering firm. I freelanced as a drafter while finishing my degree at night. 4 years into our marriage, Marcus and I started a small design-build firm together, Ashford Bell Design Group. He handled structural engineering. I handled architectural design. We specialized in affordable housing renovations that big developers ignored. It was unglamorous work, done honestly, and it built our reputation brick by brick. By year 6, we had 11 employees and a city contract. By year 8, we'd been named one of the fastest-growing minority and woman-owned firms in the state. We bought a solid, beautiful house with a wraparound porch. We had 2 children, Naomi, 7, who already sketched houses at her desk, and Elijah, 4, who could already beat his father at chess. Meanwhile, back in Charlotte, things were quietly falling apart, though I wouldn't learn the full extent of it until later. Trevor had taken over our father's commercial property holdings, straight out of business school, the same holdings, the same trust fund that had once been earmarked for me. Over the next several years, he made one reckless bet after another, over-leveraging 2 properties to fund a can't-miss development, hiding the losses from our father for over a year. And I'd later learn, telling our parents that I was unstable and difficult whenever my name came up, so they'd never feel tempted to reach out. He wasn't just failing quietly. He was actively making sure the door to reconciliation stayed shut, because a successful Rachel was a threat to the story he'd built about himself. By year 9 of my marriage, my father's portfolio had collapsed, and that's when everything came to my office door. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was reviewing blueprints when my assistant, Priya, knocked with a strange look on her face. "There's a woman here who says she's your mother," she said. "She's not alone. There's a man with her. He says he's an attorney." I sat with that for a second. 9 years of silence, and the first thing my mother does is walk in with a lawyer. Not a card, not a phone call, a lawyer. Why would my mother need legal representation just to see me? I told Priya to send them in. My mother walked through the door first, older, thinner, more silver in her hair, wearing an expensive coat that looked like armor for a battle she wasn't sure she'd win. Behind her was a man in his 50s carrying a leather folio, thick enough to be a contract, not a conversation. "Rachel," she said, "you look well." I didn't stand. "What do you need a lawyer for, Mom?" She flinched at the directness but recovered quickly, gesturing for the attorney to sit. He introduced himself as Gerald Whitfield, representing the Ashford family estate. That phrase, the estate, told me everything before he opened the folio. Here is what I pieced together over the next 20 minutes. My father's commercial property portfolio, the one Trevor had been quietly bleeding dry for 3 years, was now facing seizure by the city unless a half-finished downtown redevelopment was brought up to code within 6 months. But it was worse than a simple bailout request. Gerald explained that under the terms of my grandfather's original estate documents, my name was still listed as a contingent guarantor on one of the original property trusts, a technicality no one had bothered to remove when they cut me out, because at the time, no one imagined it would matter. They weren't just asking for help, they were telling me that, legally, I might already be financially entangled in my father's collapse, and they wanted me to sign documents formally, accepting responsibility for the project, in exchange for a small equity stake once it was saved. In other words, 9 years after declaring me dead, they'd found a technicality that could make me legally responsible for their failure, and they were hoping I wouldn't know any better. I looked at Gerald. "Send me the original trust documents. All of them. Today." He glanced at my mother, uncertain. I didn't wait for permission. I'm an architect who runs a company with 31 employees and a legal department that reviews contracts for a living. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd suggest you assume I'll read every page." That night, before the documents even arrived, my phone rang. It was my father, a man who hadn't spoken a single word to me since the day he stood silently behind my mother in that doorway. "Rachel," he said, without so much as a hello, "you're still my daughter. Whatever's happened between us, that hasn't changed. This family built everything you have a right to. You owe this family." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "You told me I was dead, Dad," I said. "Dead people don't owe their families anything." He started to argue something about blood, about legacy, about how Trevor had made mistakes but the family name still mattered. I cut him off, calm and even. The family name didn't matter 9 years ago when I needed it at my own wedding. It didn't matter when Mom took my trust fund and handed it to a son who lost it in 3 years. It only matters now tonight, because you need something from me. That's not family, Dad. That's a transaction. And I don't do business with people who've already shown me exactly what my worth is to them. I hung up before he could respond. It was the first time in 9 years I'd had the last word with my father, and it felt less like victory and more like closing a door that had been swinging in the wind for a decade. The trust paperwork arrived the next morning, and my legal team spent 2 days combing through it. What we found confirmed the lawyer's technicality was real but weak, easily challenged, and almost certainly designed to pressure a woman they assumed had no legal sophistication of her own into signing without a fight. I had my attorney send a formal response releasing me from any contingent guarantor status and closing that door permanently. But buried in the same box of estate paperwork, Gerald had sent paperwork my mother clearly hadn't reviewed closely before. Handing it over was something else entirely. A sealed letter, dated 11 years earlier, in my grandfather's handwriting, addressed to me. He had written it 2 years before he died, back when I was still in college, long before any of this happened. In it, he explained that he had set up a second, entirely separate trust in my name, smaller, more private, held outside the main family estate specifically, so it couldn't be touched by family politics, as he put it. He'd apparently sensed even then that my parents' approval of me came with conditions he didn't trust. The letter ended with one line I have read 100 times since. "If Rachel ever chooses to build her own life on her own terms, don't let anyone convince her she owes them for what I left her. She owes nothing. She only ever had to become herself." My parents had known about this second trust What made it possible for them to touch it at all was one detail my grandfather hadn't accounted for. He'd named my father as co-trustee, alongside a family attorney, until Rachel reached 30. A standard clause meant to protect a young beneficiary, not open a door for anyone else. My father, as co-trustee, had the legal authority to approve withdrawals and reinvestments on the account. Over several years, he'd approved a series of reinvestments that moved money out of my trust and into the same over-leveraged commercial properties Trevor was managing on paper, a transfer between family accounts. In practice, my inheritance quietly propping up my brother's failing bets, all without ever notifying me, because a co-trustee wasn't required to under the loose terms of that decade-old document. My own attorney later called it technically defensible, morally indefensible, legal enough that a lawsuit would be a long, ugly fight, but damning enough that no one in my family wanted it read aloud in a courtroom. I didn't sue. I didn't need to turn this into a courtroom drama to feel whole. But I did send my mother one final letter of my own, with a copy of my grandfather's letter enclosed, and a single request: full transparency on where every remaining dollar of that trust had gone, handled through attorneys, no further contact required. Here's the part I didn't expect, but which felt like the universe closing the loop on its own. 2 months after that meeting, the city of Richmond opened bidding for a $40 million mixed-use redevelopment project, affordable housing, retail, and green space. Exactly the kind of work Ashford Bell had spent 9 years quietly becoming the best in the region at. We won the bid, not because of who my father was, not because of any family name, because we had built, from a 600 square foot apartment and a broke graduate student's savings, a reputation strong enough to be the obvious, undeniable choice. The same week our contract was announced in the Regional Business Journal, I heard through a cousin that the city had finally moved to seize my father's downtown property outright. Trevor, 36 years old, moved back into our parents' house. The golden child had nothing left to be golden about. I felt no triumph in their collapse. That would have made me no different from people who once measured my worth in dollars and skin color. What I felt was quieter and permanent. The certainty that I had never needed their money, their name, or their approval to become exactly who I was always going to be. Before she left my office that day in October, my mother said one more thing, quiet and almost pleading. I know we made mistakes, Rachel. I let that sentence sit in the room for a long moment before I answered. No, Mom. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. What you did was a decision. You looked at your daughter, looked at the man she loved, and decided she wasn't worth keeping. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And now you're standing in the company I built out of that choice, asking me to save you from another one. She had no answer for that. She never has. Today, Ashford Bell Design Group has offices in 2 cities, a staff of 31, and a $40 million contract that will reshape a piece of the city we call home. Marcus and I still work together every day, and I love him more now than the day he stood beside me in that garden with 40 guests and no family of my own in the room. Naomi is 8. She keeps a drafting table beside her bed, covered in sketches of houses she says she's building for people who need somewhere soft to land. I don't know if she remembers where she heard that phrase. I do. I said it once, about our work. I didn't expect her to actually listen. My mother has not reached out again since the letters were exchanged. I've made peace with that, not the peace of forgiveness, but the peace of no longer needing an ending to a story that was never really about her. Because here's what I want you to take from this. The people who disown you for loving the wrong person, for making the wrong choice, for simply being yourself, they are not casting you into nothing. They are, whether they mean to or not, handing you the chance to build a life so undeniable that one day, they'll be the one standing in your doorway, needing something from you. My family called me dead 9 years ago. 9 years later, they needed a lawyer just to ask me for help. I have never, in my entire life, felt more alive.